The wind howled like a hungry wolf through the cracks of Windy Castle, a stone skeleton atop the grey hill. Its walls, once grand, were now just cold, moss-covered stones, echoing the despair of those seeking shelter. There, Grandfather Ilara, with calloused hands and a heavy heart, tried to light an improvised fire. Beside him, little Kale, his grandson, shivered under a thin blanket, fever burning his fragile skin. They had been expelled from the village, mocked for their poverty, and now the fury of winter pursued them, forcing them to invade that cursed place. Ilara, however, was no ordinary man. He guarded ancient legends, whispers of a forgotten past that spoke of secrets hidden deep within the castle. As the cold threatened to consume their last strength, the grandfather, with a glint of determination in his eyes, began to move a loose stone, remembering a tale of a king who hid his greatest treasure. Not in gold, but in warmth and hope. The stone, heavy and encrusted with centuries of grime, yielded under Ilara's desperate effort. It wasn't a smooth movement. It was a wrench, a silent scream of tense muscles and unyielding will. The sound of rock grating against rock echoed in the castle's vast emptiness, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the icy silence. Behind the stone, there was not just earth or more ruins, but a dark opening, a narrow tunnel that seemed to swallow the little light that dared to penetrate. Less frigid, almost stagnant air emanated from that hole, a mysterious invitation to the unknown. With an urgent nod, Ilara called Lyra. The young woman, pale and with chapped lips, tried to stand, but her legs trembled. Kyle, even in his feverish stupor, sensed the change in the air, a glimpse of something different, and his eyes opened slightly. With his grandfather's help, Lyra dragged herself towards the opening, fear and hope battling in her gaze. Ilara, with Kyle carefully nestled in his arms, followed her into the darkness. The tunnel was short, but claustrophobic, smelling of mold and something ancient, almost sacred. In a few steps, they emerged into a space that defied the desolation outside. It wasn't a room, but a vast chamber, once a library, now a silent sanctuary where time seemed to have stopped. Dark wooden shelves, worm-eaten, but still imposing, stretched to the ceiling, filled with dusty scrolls and books. And yes, there were leaves, not tree leaves, but wild vines that had invaded the walls and broken windows, intertwining with the ancient volumes, creating a living tapestry of green and brown that covered much of the surface. The air here was milder, sheltered from the cutting wind, but still cold, and the light filtering through the cracks created a ghostly play of shadows. Lyra, exhausted, collapsed onto a pile of old, torn rugs, her contractions now stronger and more frequent. "Father," she whispered, her voice weak, "I can't take it anymore." Ilara felt panic tighten his chest. Kyle coughed, his breath wheezing. The library was a refuge from the wind, but not from the cold that consumed them from within. As Ilara searched for something, anything, that could serve as shelter or fuel, his eyes scanned the shelves. Legends, he remembered, spoke of secrets hidden not in vaults, but in plain sight, disguised by nature itself. He noticed a section where the vines were particularly dense, forming a kind of natural curtain. One leaf in particular, larger and darker than the others, seemed slightly out of place, almost like a handle. Driven by a desperate intuition, Ilara extended his trembling hand and moved the leaf. It wasn't a leaf. It was a finely crafted piece of metal, camouflaged to look like part of the foliage. As he moved it, a soft click echoed in the library's silence. A section of the shelf, which had previously seemed solid, slowly rotated inward, revealing a narrow, dark passage. But this time, the air emanating from within was unmistakable, warm, humid, and with a faint aroma of herbs. With a new breath of hope, Ilara helped Lyra to her feet. Kyle, feeling the warmth, let out a groan of relief. They entered the passage, and the shelf silently rotated back into place, sealing them from the outside world. What they found was a miracle, a small room illuminated by a soft, constant light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The air was deliciously warm, and in the center, a small fireplace crackled softly, fed by an invisible source. On a rustic but clean table, there was a steaming kettle and a variety of ceramic cups. Beside it, pots of dried herbs and tea leaves, exuding sweet and comforting fragrances. Miraculous teas, Ilara thought, remembering the legend. Teas to soothe pain, to strengthen the body, to bring peace. Meanwhile, outside, the snowstorm intensified. The guards, led by Captain Vorlag, a man whose heart was as cold as the winter surrounding them, fought against the fury of the elements. Their exhausted horses could barely move in the knee-deep snow. The wind cut at their skin, transforming each snowflake into needles of ice. "Damn them," Vorlag snarled, his voice almost inaudible over the wind's howl. "That widow can't have gone far. She and the old man must be freezing in some ditch." But with each step, the hope of finding them diminished. His men, once ruthless, now trembled not just from the cold, but from a primal fear of untamed nature. Some already had blue lips, their fingers numb. The search was turning into a fight for their own survival. The castle, a dark and imposing silhouette in the distance, seemed to mock them. An unreachable bastion amidst the white fury. Inside the secret room, Lyra, with Ilara's help, lay down on an improvised but surprisingly soft bed. The warmth enveloped her body, and the aroma of the teas already seemed to soothe her pains. Ilara prepared a tea for Kyle, the herbal mixture promising to relieve the fever. A fragile but profound peace descended upon them. The baby was on its way, and for the first time in days, there was hope. But the shadow of the guards still loomed, an invisible but real threat that the warmth and miraculous tea could not erase. The world outside was an icy hell, and they were in a secret paradise. But for how long? The warmth that embraced Lyra was not just physical. It was a caress to her soul, a balm for the terror that had pursued her for so long. Lying on the improvised bed, surprisingly soft and covered with fabrics that seemed to have been forgotten there for centuries, she felt the tension in her muscles diminish. The sweet, earthy aroma of the teas lingered in the air, and each deep breath seemed to fill her lungs with new life. The contractions, once brutal and incessant, now came in more spaced, less acute waves, as if the room itself was whispering to her body, "Calm, here you are safe." Ilara, with steady hands, offered Kyle a steaming cup. The boy, his eyes still glazed with fever, sipped the bitter liquid with a faint groan. In a few minutes, Kyle's forehead, previously scalding, began to cool. His breathing, which had wheezed with effort, became softer, more rhythmic. The grandfather watched, marveling as the magic unfolded. It wasn't just warmth. It was healing. This place, this hidden refuge, was more than a shelter. It was a sanctuary of restoration. As Kyle drifted into a restorative sleep, Ilara turned to Lyra. His daughter, though still pale, had a different light in her eyes, a spark of hope he hadn't seen in weeks. He prepared a different tea for her, one with herbs that seemed to vibrate with a gentle energy. "Drink, my daughter," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "It's for you and the baby." Lyra obeyed, feeling the warm liquid go down her throat, warming her from the inside out. A feeling of strength, slow but constant, began to spread through her exhausted body. Outside, the world was a white hell. The snowstorm had transformed into a ravenous monster, swallowing the landscape in a whirlwind of ice and wind. Captain Vorlag, his face cut by the wind and his beard frozen, could barely stand. His men, once imposing figures in their armor, were now just stumbling shadows, each step a battle against the waist-deep snow. The horses' whinnies were a distant lament, muffled by the fury of the elements. Two of them had already fallen, exhausted, their bodies quickly covered by a white shroud. "Advance!" Vorlag shouted, his voice hoarse and almost inaudible, but his words were just another sound, lost in the wind's howl. He tried to keep the image of the widow and the old man freezing in his mind, a fuel for his cruelty. But the reality of the storm was a far more formidable enemy. His fingers, inside his leather gloves, were numb, and he knew the frostbite had already begun its insidious work. He looked at the castle, a ghostly silhouette in the distance, and for a moment it seemed the very stones were mocking his futility. Inside the secret room, the contrast was almost unbearable. The fireplace, fed by an invisible source, crackled softly, casting a golden glow on the walls. Ilara noticed that the walls were not rough stone, but lined with a smooth, warm-to-the-touch material, adorned with intricate patterns that seemed to dance in the light. There were shelves with more pots of herbs, some shimmering with golden powder, others exuding aromas Ilara had never smelled before. This was no ordinary place. It was a sanctuary from a forgotten era, a gift from the ancients to those who found it in their moment of greatest need. Lyra, feeling a new wave of contraction, stronger this time but still bearable, squeezed Ilara's hand. "Father," she whispered, but it wasn't a cry of pain, rather a warning. The baby was coming. Ilara, with a lump in his throat, knew time was essential. He took a ceramic bowl and filled it with warm water from a spring that gently flowed from one of the walls. The water was crystalline and seemed to have a glow of its own. Outside, one of the guards, a young recruit named Theron, fell to his knees. His lips were blue, and his eyes, once full of zeal, now reflected only the emptiness of despair. "Captain, we can't go on," he managed to stammer before collapsing completely in the snow. Vorlag looked at him with contempt, but he no longer had the energy to punish. He himself felt the cold creeping up his legs, paralyzing his thoughts. The hunt had turned into a death march, and the prey somehow had vanished into the icy ether. The castle, once a beacon of hope for finding the fugitives, now seemed a tomb for their pursuers. Inside the room, Lyra took a deep breath, focusing on the life pulsating within her. The miraculous tea had done more than just soothe. It had infused her with a serene courage, a strength she didn't know she possessed. Ilara, kneeling beside her, murmured words of encouragement, his eyes fixed on his daughter, but his ears still attentive to the distant howls of the storm. He knew that peace was fragile, that the world outside still posed a threat, but in that moment, in that small refuge of warmth and light, life was about to triumph over death, hope over despair. The baby's first cry was imminent, and with it, the promise of a new beginning, a miracle born amidst the fury of winter. The baby's first cry was imminent, and with it, the promise of a new beginning, a miracle born amidst the fury of winter. Lyra, teeth clenched, felt the final, most powerful wave sweep through her body. There was no more room for fear, only for the ancestral strength that propelled her. Her eyes, once filled with dread, now burned with fierce determination. Ilara, kneeling, held her hand firmly, words of encouragement murmured like a mantra, a thread of hope amidst the storm of her pain. Outside, the storm showed no signs of relenting. The wind howled like a chorus of hungry demons, and the snow, driven by this invisible fury, lashed at the few remaining guards. Captain Vorlag, a pathetic frozen figure, dragged himself through the knee-deep snow. Theron's body, the young recruit, was already almost unrecognizable, a white mound in the monochromatic landscape. Two more men had fallen, their moans muffled by the wind before the silence of the ice swallowed them. Only 3 remained, besides the captain, and each of them was a spectre of himself, their heavy armor transformed into icy shackles. Vorlag felt the cold pierce his gloves, his fingers already numb like dead wood. The pain, once a sharp pang, was now a deep numbness, a premonition of the end. The image of the widow and the old man, which had once driven him, faded, replaced by the sight of his own men falling one by one in the relentless snow. He looked at the castle, the dark and imposing silhouette, and a cold rage, more potent than winter itself, ignited in his chest. They couldn't have disappeared. They couldn't have escaped. It was an affront, a mockery from the heavens. Back in the sanctuary, Lyra's breathing was a guttural sound, a supreme effort. The warmth of the room, the aromatic herbs, Ilara's calming presence, all merged into a single purpose. Kyle, in his deep sleep, turned over, a small smile on his lips, oblivious to his mother's battle. The crystalline water in the ceramic bowl, warmed by the magical spring, reflected the golden glow of the fireplace, a mirror of the life that was about to emerge. And then, with one last effort, a primal cry that echoed off the warm walls of the room. The purest and most powerful sound broke the silence. The cry of a newborn. A sound of life, of hope, of a miracle that defied the darkness of the world outside. Lyra collapsed onto the bed, exhausted, but a radiant smile lit her pale face. Ilara, with tears in his eyes, held the tiny body, wrapped in a soft blanket that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. "It's a girl, my Lyra," he whispered. His voice choked with emotion, offering the baby to her mother's arms. The tiny creature, red and wrinkled, but perfect in her fragility, waved her minuscule fists, her cry a melody of triumph. Lyra embraced her, feeling the warmth of her daughter's body against hers, a warmth that seemed capable of melting the deepest ice. The terror of the pursuit, the pain of childbirth, all dissolved in that instant, replaced by an overwhelming love. Meanwhile, outside, Vorlag stumbled, falling to his knees in the snow. His lungs burned, and each breath was a stab of ice. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't respond. The last of his men, a giant named Borin, staggered beside him, eyes vacant, before collapsing without a sound. Vorlag was alone, surrounded by the white fury, the castle a distant mirage. Rage abandoned him, replaced by an icy despair. He could no longer feel his feet, his hands. The blizzard was a shroud, and he, the victim. Inside the sanctuary, Lyra nursed her daughter, the girl's face nestled against her chest. Kyle, awakened by the crying, stretched, and seeing his sister, his eyes widened in admiration. Ilara watched the scene, his heart overflowing with a gratitude he never thought he would feel again. This magical place was not just a shelter. It was a cradle for new life, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. But peace, he knew, was fragile. Even with the warmth and security of the room, a shadow persisted. The world outside still existed, and with it the threat. He approached the secret door, the one leading to the library, and pressed his ear against it. The wind's howl was a distant lament, almost inaudible. But he swore he heard something more, a faint sound, a muffled groan that wasn't the wind. Was it his imagination, or were the echoes of cruelty still trying to penetrate the sanctuary? He turned, looking at Lyra and his daughter, at Kyle, who was now caressing his sister's tiny hand. Life had triumphed, yes, but the battle was not yet over. Survival was a miracle, but freedom, true peace, was still a distant promise. The sanctuary protected them from winter, but the winter of men's hearts was a far harder force to combat. And Vorlag, he knew, was not a man who would give up easily, even on the brink of death. The question wasn't whether he would survive, but whether his cruelty would survive the storm, and what that would mean for them. The muffled groan. Ilara had heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't wood creaking under the weight of snow. It was a human sound, faint, but laden with an agony that chilled the blood. He approached the secret door, the one leading to the library, his heart pounding in his chest. The sanctuary's warmth, once a comforting embrace, now felt like a fragile bubble about to burst under the pressure of the outside world. Lyra, exhausted but radiant, cradled her newborn daughter, her eyes fixed on the tiny creature sleeping serenely in her arms. Kyle, beside her, caressed his sister's tiny hand, an innocent smile on his face. The scene was one of pure peace, a brutal contrast to the darkness Ilara felt creeping into his refuge. He pressed his ear against the smooth, warm wood. The storm's howl was now a distant lament, almost a whisper, but the sound that disturbed him was still there, more subtle, more persistent, a dragging, a scraping of something heavy against the icy library floor. It couldn't be. The guards had fallen one by one, swallowed by the white fury. Vorlag, the captain, was on the brink of death, his men transformed into icy statues. But the sound was real. With bated breath, Ilara searched for a crack, an observation point. The walls of the secret room were perfectly sealed, but he remembered the wild leaf he had moved to reveal the door. There was a small, almost imperceptible opening where the leaf fit. With trembling fingers, he moved the leaf again, just enough to create a tiny slit, an eye into the eye of the storm. What he saw made his blood run cold. The library was almost entirely covered by snow that had penetrated through the broken windows. Piles of ancient books, once proud, were now white, shapeless mountains. But in the midst of that icy chaos, a figure dragged itself. It was Vorlag, or what was left of him. His body was covered in a thick layer of ice, his armor once gleaming, now an opaque, frozen carapace. His movements were slow, painful, each inch a battle against the ice that encased him. He wasn't walking, he was crawling, using his elbows and knees, leaving a trail of ice and blood in the snow. Vorlag's eyes, once full of cruelty and determination, were now just red, swollen slits in a face disfigured by the cold. But even so, there was something in them, a flame, not of life, but of pure hatred, of a malignant obstinacy that refused to die. He wasn't looking at the secret door, not directly. His eyes swept the library, searching, sniffing, like a wounded but still dangerous animal. He was lost, disoriented, but his intention was clear, to find his prey. Ilara recoiled from the slit, his heart pounding erratically. That was not a man, it was a spectre, a ghost of cruelty that refused to be swept away by the storm. The promise that Vorlag's malice would survive the winter now materialized before his eyes. He had not died, not yet, and his presence, even weakened, was a palpable threat. He closed the slit, the wild leaf returning to its place, sealing the sanctuary's secret. The room's warmth felt less comforting now, more like a disguise, an illusion. Lyra, oblivious to the horror her father had just witnessed, smiled at her daughter, a smile of pure happiness. "She's so tiny, father," she whispered, her voice full of love. "And so strong." Ilara tried to smile back, but his lips were stiff. The strength of the tiny creature was a miracle, yes, but the strength of Vorlag's malice was a curse. He approached the fireplace, feeling the warmth in his hands, but the cold he felt was of another nature, a cold that came from within, from the fear that now dominated him. What would they do? Vorlag was out there, crawling, a frozen machine of hatred. He couldn't enter the sanctuary, couldn't see the door, but his presence was a constant reminder that the world outside hadn't disappeared, that the threat hadn't been eliminated. Let him die slowly in the icy library. It was a terrible death, but he was a monster. Yet the idea that he might somehow survive, that he might find a way to rise again, that his cruelty might transform into something even darker, was unbearable. Ilara looked at Lyra, at his newborn granddaughter, at Kale. They were safe for now, but for how long? The sanctuary was a refuge, but it wasn't a prison. They would need to leave one day, and when they did, what would await them? The snowstorm might have swept away most of their pursuers, but the seed of evil still persisted. embodied in that frozen captain who refused to yield to death. The peace they had found was more fragile than ever, a breath of life in a world of ice and hatred. And Ilara knew that the true battle for their freedom, for their peace, was just beginning. The air in the sanctuary, once a warm and protective embrace, now felt thin, heavy with the icy revelation. Ilara felt a shiver run down his spine, a cold that no fireplace could dissipate. Vorlag, that name once synonymous with relentless pursuit, was now the personification of a malice that refused to be swept away by death. He was not just a man, he was a shadow, a persistent stain on the hope that had just been born. His eyes fixed on Lyra, who, oblivious to the creeping threat, cradled her daughter with a tenderness that broke Ilara's heart. The tiny creature, whom Lyra had already whispered the name Aurora, slept deeply, a small miracle of life in such a brutal world. Kyle, with a child's innocence, watched his sister with silent fascination, his tiny fingers exploring the soft blanket. This scene of peace, so precious and fragile, was what Ilara had sworn to protect, and now the threat was mere feet away, beyond a secret door and a thin layer of wood. Ilara stepped away from the door, feeling the weight of the decision fall upon his shoulders. What to do with a monster who refused to die? Let him slowly freeze in the library, an agonizing and deserved death for such a cruel man. The idea was tempting, a poetic justice for the lives he had destroyed. But the image of Vorlag, crawling like a wounded worm, yet with the flame of hatred in his eyes, was disturbing. What if he survived somehow? What if in time he found a way to rise again, to strengthen himself, driven by an even darker vengeance? The library was a labyrinth of shelves and books, now a mausoleum of ice and snow. Vorlag was trapped there, but he wasn't inert. Ilara had heard the dragging, the scraping. He was moving, albeit slowly, albeit aimlessly. It was the persistence of evil, a force that seemed to defy the laws of nature. The sanctuary, with its healing herbs and miraculous teas, had offered peace for birth, but it didn't seem to have a potion to eradicate human malice. He approached the fireplace, extending his hands to the warmth, seeking some comfort that could calm the storm in his own chest. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. But the cold Ilara felt was of another nature, a cold that came from fear and uncertainty. The promise that Vorlag's malice would survive the winter now materialized terrifyingly. "Father," Lyra's soft voice pulled him from his dark thoughts. "Is everything all right? You look worried." Ilara forced a smile, trying to hide the anguish that consumed him. "It's nothing, my daughter, just tiredness and the wonder of seeing Aurora." He knelt beside the bed, watching his granddaughter. Aurora was a small beacon of hope, a reminder of what was at stake. The life she represented was the antithesis of everything Vorlag embodied. But the lie burned in his throat. He couldn't tell Lyra about Vorlag, not now. The joy of childbirth, the peace she had finally found, would be shattered by the news that the captain was still out there, crawling a latent threat. As Lyra and Kyle lost themselves in the contemplation of new life, Ilara again approached the secret door. He didn't open the slit again. He didn't need to. The image of Vorlag, a frozen specter of hatred, was etched in his mind. He could almost feel the captain's presence through the wood, an aura of malevolence that seemed to try to pierce the sanctuary's defenses. What was expected of him? Mercy for an enemy who knew no mercy? Or the cold logic of self-preservation? If he left him there, Vorlag would die. It was a certainty, given the extent of his injuries and the brutal cold, but the waiting, the uncertainty of every sound, every drag would be torture. And what if, by some dark miracle, Vorlag found a crack, a weakness in the library, and managed to approach the door? He didn't know what the captain would do, but he knew it would be nothing good. Ilara pondered the herbs, the teas. Was there something there that could neutralize evil, or at least the physical threat? The sanctuary's magical properties were for life, for healing, for peace, not for war, not for eliminating enemies. He felt powerless, caught between morality and the need to protect his family. A faint sound, a muffled groan, but more distinct this time, echoed through the wood. It wasn't the wind. It was Vorlag. He was suffering, yes, but the sound also carried a stubbornness, a refusal to yield. Ilara closed his eyes, his mind in a whirlwind. Peace was an illusion, a bubble about to burst. The true battle, the battle for lasting freedom and security, was just beginning. And it would not be fought with miraculous teas, but with difficult decisions and perhaps with sacrifices. The winter of men's hearts was, indeed, the hardest force to combat, and Vorlag, even on the brink of death, was living proof of it. The groan. It wasn't just a sound of pain, but a hoarse lament, laden with contained fury, a stubbornness that defied death itself. Ilara felt the air leave his lungs, the fireplace's warmth suddenly insufficient. That sound was irrefutable proof that Vorlag was not a memory, but a presence, a heavy burden the sanctuary could not dispel. Peace was an illusion, a thin veil over an abyss of terror. He stepped away from the door, his steps heavy, as if each movement required monumental effort. The image of Lyra cradling Aurora with a serene smile, and Chaol, fascinated by his sister, was a brutal contrast to the darkness nesting just a few feet away. How could he protect this light if Vorlag's shadow persisted, crawling and groaning, refusing to disappear? Ilara's mind spun in a whirlwind of thoughts. Let him die. It was the simplest solution, the cruelest, but perhaps the most necessary. He was a monster, an executioner. His hands were stained with innocent blood. Justice, if it existed, demanded his punishment. But the idea of a man, even such a vile man, slowly freezing, agonizing, was a weight Ilara didn't know if he could bear. It wasn't death itself, but the manner of death, the torturous slowness that haunted him. He approached the table where the miraculous teas rested, their vibrant colors seeming to mock the darkness that consumed him. Teas to heal, to soothe, to bring life. There was no tea to eradicate evil, to silence the threat without dirtying one's own hands. The sanctuary was a refuge of life, not a battlefield. And yet the battle was there, invisible but palpable, fought between the persistence of hatred and the fragility of hope. A new sound, this time a stronger drag, followed by a muffled thud. Vorlag was moving with difficulty, but moving. Was he trying to get up? Was he approaching the door? Paranoia began to gnaw at the edges of Ilara's sanity. He knew the door was invisible from the outside, camouflaged by the wild leaves. But Vorlag's obsession, his unwavering cruelty, could lead him to sniff out, to sense the presence even if he couldn't see. Ilara knelt again beside the slit, hesitating. Opening it meant confronting the sight of Vorlag again, reliving the horror. But not opening it meant remaining in ignorance, allowing fear to fill the gaps with the worst fantasies. With a trembling sigh, he moved the leaf, opening a tiny slit, an eye into the darkness. The library was even more covered in snow. The piles of books now looked like icebergs, and there, a few feet from the door, was Vorlag. He had managed to drag himself closer. His body was even more covered in ice, almost unrecognizable, a grotesque statue of suffering and hatred. His eyes, once red slits, now seemed almost closed, but there was still a spark, a sickly gleam that refused to extinguish. He wasn't crawling in a straight line. He was moving in circles, like a cornered animal, wounded and disoriented. But the circles were closing in, slowly, around the area where the secret door was hidden. Not that he knew it, but it was as if his malice guided him, an inverted compass pointing to the source of his frustration. Suddenly, Vorlag stopped. His head, heavy and covered in ice, lifted slightly. A guttural sound escaped his cracked lips, not a groan, but something closer to a growl, a curse muffled by the cold. And then he began to knock. Not forcefully, but with the tip of his frozen gauntlet, a slow, irregular rhythm against a snow-covered bookshelf right beside the secret door. Tap, tap, tap. Ilara recoiled abruptly, closing the slit. The sound echoed in his mind, a macabre drum that seemed to vibrate through the sanctuary walls. He wasn't knocking on the door. He was knocking on the shelf next to it, but it was too close, too intentional. It was as if he was testing, exploring, feeling the vibration, searching for a weakness. "Father, what was that?" Lyra's voice, full of concern, brought him back. She had noticed his agitation, the tension in his body. He turned, trying to compose himself, but the sound of tap, tap, tap still resonated in his ears. "Nothing, my daughter. Just a branch tapping against the window outside. The storm is still strong." The lie was a heavy burden, but the truth would be devastating. Lyra didn't need to know that the monster who had pursued her to the ends of the earth was now knocking at the door of their refuge, a frozen spectre of vengeance. He looked at Aurora, sleeping peacefully, and at Kyle, who now watched him with curious eyes. Their innocence was a fragile shield against the world's cruelty. Ilara felt a lump in his throat. He could not fail them. He could not allow Vorlag's malice, in its most persistent and agonizing form, to reach them. The idea of letting Vorlag die slowly seemed less a matter of justice and more a dangerous gamble. What if he didn't die? What if his obstinacy kept him alive for days, weeks, a constant torment, a threat that refused to disappear? The peace they had found was a mirage, and the true battle, the battle for lasting security, would require more than hiding places and miraculous teas. It would require a decision, a terrible decision. And Ilara knew, with a chill that did not come from the outside cold, that the time for that decision was running out. The tap, 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 continued, a constant reminder that evil, even on the brink of death, could still knock at their door. The tap, tap, tap did not cease. It was a slow, irregular, but relentless rhythm, like the heartbeat of a dying monster refusing to die. Each beat resonated not only in the bookshelf's wood, but in Ilara's bones, in his soul. He felt Lyra's gaze, heavy with a concern he tried in vain to disguise, Aurora's innocence sleeping so deeply, and Kyle's curiosity, who now seemed to try to decipher the tension in the air, were a cruel reminder of what was at stake. "Father, what is that?" Kel asked, his voice low but clear. "Is it the wind?" Ilara turned to the boy, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, Kel, just the wind, and perhaps a stubborn branch tapping against the wall. The storm is still very strong." But Kyle was no fool. His eyes drifted to the area of the secret door, to the bookshelf from which the sound seemed to emanate. He couldn't see the door, of course, but the vibration, the persistence of the sound, was undeniable. Ilara felt a chill. If Kale, with his young, receptive mind, was sensing something, how long would it take for Lyra, with her maternal instincts sharpened by recent danger, to also feel the truth? The lie was a heavy burden, but the truth would be a devastating blow. Lyra had just found peace, security for her daughter. To shatter that bubble of happiness with the news that the executioner was still out there, knocking at their door, would be unforgivable. Ilara approached the fireplace, the warmth, once so comforting, now seeming insufficient to warm the anguish that consumed him. He looked at the herbs, at the teas. That sanctuary was a refuge of life, of healing. There was no potion to silence hatred, to eradicate evil without dirtying one's own hands. The peace he had promised Lyra was being corroded, battered, scratched by Vorlag's persistence. The tap, tap, tap continued, but now, between the beats, Ilara could discern a new sound, a drag, stronger, more deliberate. Vorlag wasn't just knocking, he was moving, scraping against the bookshelf, as if trying to find a crack, a weakness in the structure. Malice, even on the brink of death, was a cunning predator, sniffing out life through wood and stone. Ilara's mind spun, letting him die slowly, agonizing in the cold. Seemed a cruelty he didn't wish to inflict even on a monster. But the alternative, the idea that Vorlag might somehow find a breach, or that his constant presence could drive them mad, was equally terrifying. What if he didn't die? What if his obstinacy kept him alive for days, weeks, a constant torment, a threat that refused to disappear? He knelt again beside the slit, hesitating. What would he see this time? An even more grotesque spectre of suffering, or a glimpse of renewed determination, a spark of hatred that the cold couldn't extinguish? With a trembling sigh, he moved the leaf, opening a tiny slit, an eye into the darkness. The library was even more covered in snow, the books looking like icy mountains. And there, a few feet from the door, was Vorlag. He had managed to drag himself even closer. His body was almost unrecognizable, a grotesque statue of ice and hatred. His eyes, once red slits, now seemed almost closed, but there was still a spark, a sickly gleam that refused to extinguish. The lie was a heavy burden, but the truth would be devastating. Lyra didn't need to know that the monster who had pursued her to the ends of the earth was now knocking at the door of their refuge, a frozen spectre of vengeance. He looked at Aurora, sleeping peacefully, and at Kyle, who now watched him with curious eyes. Their innocence was a fragile shield against the world's cruelty. Ilara felt a lump in his throat. He could not fail them. He could not allow Vorlag's malice, in its most persistent and agonizing form, to reach them. The idea of letting Vorlag die slowly seemed less a matter of justice and more a dangerous gamble. What if he didn't die? What if his obstinacy kept him alive for days, weeks, a constant torment, a threat that refused to disappear? The peace they had found was a mirage, and the true battle, the battle for lasting security, would require more than hiding places and miraculous teas. It would require a decision, a terrible decision. And Ilara knew, with a chill that did not come from the outside cold, that the time for that decision was running out. The tap, tap, tap continued, a constant reminder that evil, even on the brink of death, could still knock at their door. But now, the sound seemed stronger, more insistent. It was no longer a test, but a demand. Vorlag was approaching the threshold of consciousness, and his frozen fury was becoming more focused. Ilara could almost feel the captain's icy breath through the wood, a promise of vengeance that the cold could not silence. He needed to act, but how? With what? He had no weapons, no combat experience. The sanctuary was for life, not for death. But death was knocking at the door, and if he didn't do something, it could enter. The terrible decision hung over him, an unbearable weight. It was Vorlag's life against his family's life, and Ilara knew there was only one possible choice, no matter how his soul rebelled against it, but how to execute it without becoming the monster he so despised. The answer did not come, only the tap, 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 and the heavy silence of his own conscience. The tap, tap, tap was no longer a distant sound, an irregular tap of a stubborn branch. It had transformed into an insistent hammering, a macabre rhythm that seemed to echo directly from Vorlag's frozen heart. Each beat resonated through the sanctuary walls, vibrating through wood and stone, and, more deeply, in Ilara's bones. It was no longer a test. It was a demand for entry, for vengeance, for malice that refused to be silenced by imminent death. Lyra stood up, the expression on her face no longer one of veiled concern, but of a cold, growing certainty. Her eyes met Ilara's, and in them there was no more room for comforting lies. "Father," she said, her voice low but laden with an authority Ilara rarely saw in her. "It's not the wind. It's not a branch. What's out there?" Kyle, who had approached the bookshelf, now had his ear pressed against the wood, his tiny fingers tracing the grooves of the books. "Is it a monster, Father?" he whispered, the innocence of his question cutting Ilara like a knife. The truth, which he had tried so hard to hide, was about to unfold before them, and Ilara felt the ground beneath his feet collapse. He could no longer flee. The peace he had promised, the sanctuary he had found, everything was threatened by Vorlag's relentless persistence. He looked at Aurora, sleeping in her improvised cradle, a small oasis of serenity amidst the storm of terror that was forming. That baby was the reason for everything, the future he needed to protect at all costs. The tap, tap, tap intensified, now accompanied by a guttural sound, a dragging of ice and metal against the wood, as if Vorlag was trying to tear at the bookshelf, unearth the secret door with his own frozen hands. Ilara could almost feel the captain's icy breath through the wood, a promise of vengeance that the cold could not silence. He turned to Lyra and Kale, his eyes expressing pain and determination. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice hoarse. "Stay away from the bookshelf. No matter what happens, don't come near." He didn't wait for a response. His mind raced, searching for a solution, a way to carry out the terrible decision without becoming the monster he so despised. He had no weapons, no combat experience. The sanctuary was for life, not for death. But death was knocking at the door, and if he didn't do something, it could enter and reap the life he cherished so much. His eyes swept the room, searching for something, anything, the herbs, the teas, the ancient books. Nothing there was for violence, but what he had was knowledge of the structure, of how the secret door fit perfectly into the bookshelf, camouflaged by the wild leaves. He knew how it opened, how it closed, and perhaps how it could be sealed. With a heavy sigh, Ilara approached the bookshelf, ignoring Lyra and Kale's apprehensive glances. Vorlag's sound was now a frenzy of thuds and scratches, a furious lament of a cornered predator. Ilara knelt not to peek, but to examine the base of the bookshelf, how it connected to the floor and the stone wall. The secret door was an ingenious piece of engineering, but it was also part of the library's larger structure. He realized that the bookshelf was not just a disguise, it was a support point. If the bookshelf were compromised, the door would be inaccessible, and if the bookshelf were compromised in a specific way, perhaps it could become an insurmountable barrier, using the very force of the storm and ice against Vorlag. The idea was risky, desperate. He would have to destabilize the bookshelf from within, hoping that the weight of the accumulated snow outside and Vorlag's own pressure would do the rest. It would be an act of containment, not murder, a way to bury the threat without dirtying his hands with blood. He began to feel along the wood, searching for connection points, for screws or latches that could be loosened. His fingers found a small, almost imperceptible lever, which he knew was part of the door's camouflage mechanism. But there was another, deeper one, which he rarely used, designed to reinforce the bookshelf in case of earthquakes or major impacts. The tap, tap, tap became a muffled roar, and Ilara felt the bookshelf tremble under his hands. Vorlag was throwing himself against it now, a last, desperate attack. There was no more time. With a cry of effort, Ilara pulled the deeper lever, feeling a dry, painful snap. The bookshelf groaned, a loud, sharp sound that made Lyra and Kyle cry out in fright. A trickle of snow and wood dust seeped through the door's slit, and the sound outside changed drastically. Vorlag's furious hammering was replaced by a muffled crash, a sound of something heavy giving way, of ice and wood breaking. The bookshelf, now destabilized, tilted slightly outward, creating a larger gap in the library wall. The wind howled, bringing with it a whirlwind of snow that began to fill the newly created opening. Ilara could hear the sound of something being crushed, of ice breaking, followed by a sudden, terrifying silence. The tap, tap, tap ceased. The dragging stopped. Only the wind's howl and the rustle of falling snow. Ilara recoiled, gasping, his heart pounding uncontrollably. Lyra ran to him, hugging him tightly, Kyle clinging to his legs. The air in the sanctuary, once so warm and welcoming, now felt charged with a cold tension, with a decision that had been made. The bookshelf was crooked, and the gap that had opened was rapidly being filled by snow. The secret door was now sealed, not by a lock, but by the very fury of the storm. The silence that followed was deafening, more terrifying than any knock. Ilara looked at the bookshelf, at the accumulating snow, at the void where the threat had once been. He didn't know if Vorlag was dead, if he was merely buried, or if somehow he could still emerge. But for now, the threat had been contained. At a terrible cost to his own soul, but his family was safe, for now. The burden of the decision weighed on him, an icy reminder that peace, even in a sanctuary, often demanded unthinkable sacrifices. The silence that followed that crash was more deafening than any knock, more terrifying than the storm's howl. It was a heavy silence, laden with snow, and an irreversible decision. Ilara recoiled from the bookshelf, gasping, his heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum. Lyra ran to him, her small arms wrapping around him with surprising strength, her face buried in his chest. Kyle, wide-eyed, clung to his legs, a small tremor running through his body. The air in the sanctuary, once so warm and welcoming, now felt charged with a cold tension, an invisible stain that refused to dissipate. A trickle of snow and wood dust seeped through the now larger gap, an icy reminder of the violence that had just occurred. The bookshelf was crooked, tilted outward, and the gap that had opened was rapidly being filled by the relentless snow the storm continued to push. The secret door, once an ingenious refuge, was now sealed, not by a lock, but by the very fury of nature. Ilara looked at the bookshelf, at the accumulating snow, at the void where the threat had once been. He didn't know if Vorlag was dead, if he was merely buried under a mountain of ice and broken wood, or if somehow, miraculously, he could still emerge. The uncertainty was a slow poison, corroding the small victory he had achieved. Lyra lifted her face, her eyes teary, but with a courage Ilara admired. "Father, what happened? Is he gone?" Her voice was a fragile whisper, laden with hope and fear. Ilara pressed her against him, kissing the top of her head. "Yes, my daughter. He's gone. The storm, it took him." The lie, once again, was a necessary shield. How to explain to a child the brutality of a man who refused to die, and the even greater brutality of a father who had to act to contain him? Kyle, still clinging to his legs, looked at the bookshelf with a mixture of fascination and terror. "Is the monster gone, father?" "Yes, Kyle, the monster is gone," Ilara confirmed, his voice choked. But the truth was, the monster wasn't just out there. A part of it, the part that had been forced to act with such desperation, now resided within Ilara. He felt the cold of the entering snow, but more than that, he felt the cold of his own conscience. He knelt, examining the gap. The wind howled through it, bringing gusts of icy air that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. Snow already formed a small dune on the stone floor. The bookshelf, though tilted, seemed to have stabilized, held in place by the weight of the snow and ice pressing against it from outside. It was an improvised barrier, but for how long would it last? The sanctuary's integrity was compromised. "We need to fix this," he murmured, more to himself than to the children. If the snow continued to come in, The room's warmth would dissipate, and the sanctuary would lose its protective essence. Moreover, the gap was an open wound, a constant reminder of their vulnerability. He stood, his eyes sweeping the room, where to find materials to seal such a large gap. The wild leaves that covered the secret door outside were now part of the snow and ice barrier. Inside, he had books, teapots, blankets, nothing that could seal an opening against the fury of a storm. Lyra, noticing the concern on his face, pointed to the blankets they had used to keep warm. "Can we use the blankets, Father, to cover the hole?" Ilara looked at the blankets, then at the gap. It wouldn't be ideal, but it was the only resource they had. It would be a temporary solution, a palliative against the cold and the memory of what had happened. "Yes, Lyra, that's a good idea. Bring them here." As Lyra and Kale, with an unusual seriousness for their ages, began to collect the blankets, Ilara again approached the bookshelf. He touched the cold wood, feeling the subtle tremor that still ran through the structure. The silence outside was disturbing. There was no longer the sound of knocking, nor scratching, nor Vorlag's furious lament. Only the constant howl of the wind, a sound that now seemed to carry a new kind of threat, the threat of the unknown, of uncertainty. He couldn't afford to think about what he had done, or what might have happened to Vorlag. His priority was his family's safety. He needed to seal that gap, restore the sanctuary's integrity, and try somehow to restore the sense of peace that had been so brutally broken. With the blankets in hand, Ilara began to stuff them into the gaps of the bookshelf and wall, trying to seal as much of the opening as possible. The soft material absorbed some of the wind, but the cold still penetrated. It was a fight against nature, against time, and against memory itself. Each piece of fabric pushed into the gap was an act of denial, an attempt to cover not just the cold, but also the darkness that had infiltrated their sanctuary. Aurora, oblivious to all the drama, let out a small whimper in her improvised cradle. Ilara looked at her, at the untouched innocence of her sleep, and felt a pang of hope. She was the future, the reason he had fought, the reason he had made such a terrible decision. But the peace he so desired still seemed distant. The gap in the bookshelf was a constant reminder that the outside world, with its cruelty and its monsters, was always lurking. And the silence outside, that deep and unsettling silence, was proof that sometimes the absence of sound can be the most terrifying of threats. The battle for lasting security had not ended. It had merely changed form, from a physical confrontation to a silent war against fear and uncertainty. And Ilara knew with a chill that did not come from the outside cold, that the days that followed would be the most challenging of their lives. Vorlag's shadow, even if invisible, still loomed over them. The air in the sanctuary, once a warm and constant embrace, now trembled with the invasion of cold. The blankets, desperately stuffed into the gaps of the bookshelf and wall, were a fragile defense, a handkerchief against a gale. The wind howled through the fibers, an icy lament that made Ilara's hairs stand on end. Not just from the cold, but from the vivid memory of the crash that preceded that silence. The relentless snow continued to accumulate, forming a small white dune on the stone floor, an icy reminder of the barrier that had been broken. Ilara stepped away from the bookshelf, his hands dirty with dust and with the sensation of ice that seemed to have infiltrated his bones. Lyra and Kyle, exhausted, had nestled near Aurora's cradle, seeking the warmth that still emanated from that tiny life. But even the miraculous warmth of the room seemed to struggle to maintain itself, diluted by the icy draft that now permeated the environment. The gap in the wall was not just a physical opening, it was an open wound in the sanctuary's soul, a portal to the cruelty of the outside world. The silence outside was the most terrifying of all sounds. There was no longer Vorlag's furious hammering, nor his grunts of rage, nor the dragging of his heavy feet. only the constant howl of the wind, a sound that now seemed to carry a new kind of threat, the threat of the unknown, of uncertainty. Ilara didn't know if Vorlag was dead, if he was merely buried under a mountain of ice and broken wood, or if somehow, miraculously, he could still emerge. The uncertainty was a slow poison, corroding the small victory he had achieved. He knelt near Aurora, watching her sleep, her small, serene face, oblivious to all the violence and despair that surrounded her. She was the future, the reason he had fought, the reason he had made such a terrible decision. But the peace he so desired still seemed distant. The gap in the bookshelf was a constant reminder that the outside world, with its cruelty and its monsters, was always lurking. And the silence outside, that deep and unsettling silence, was proof that sometimes the absence of sound can be the most terrifying of threats. Night advanced, and with it, the cold intensified. The blankets, once sources of comfort, now seemed insufficient. Ilara lit another candle, the flame flickering precariously under the invisible breath of the entering wind. He looked at the miraculous teas, at the herbs that promised warmth and healing. Would they be enough to combat the cold that was now infiltrating the very heart of the sanctuary? Lyra approached, her eyes heavy with sleep, but with a concern mature for her age. "Father, it's very cold. Will Aurora be okay?" Her voice was a whisper, but the question echoed in Ilara's mind like an alarm bell. Aurora's vulnerability was his greatest weakness and his greatest strength. "She'll be fine, my daughter," Ilara replied, pulling her into a tight embrace, trying to convey a confidence he himself didn't feel. "We'll make some hot tea and we'll all huddle together." He prepared the tea, the aromatic herbs releasing their warm steam, a small comfort against the invading cold. But as he served the cups, his eyes kept returning to the damaged bookshelf, to the snow that continued to accumulate. The sanctuary's integrity was compromised. What would happen if the storm intensified even more? And what if the bookshelf, already destabilized, gave way completely? With each gust of wind that penetrated, Ilara felt the weight of his decision. He had acted to protect, but the line between protection and destruction was thin. The image of Vorlag's body, crushed under the weight of the bookshelf and snow, haunted his thoughts. He was a man, a father, forced to become something more, something darker, to ensure his family's survival. Kyle, who had fallen asleep in Lyra's arms, let out a whimper. Ilara approached, covering him with an extra blanket. He needed to find a more permanent solution, something that could seal the gap and restore the sanctuary's warmth and security. But with what? The library, though full of treasures, offered no building materials. His eyes swept the shelves, past ancient volumes, dusty scrolls. And then something caught his attention. On a higher shelf, almost hidden behind some large tomes, there was a stack of thin wooden boards, carefully piled. They were binding boards, used to restore old books, but perhaps they could serve for something more. He reached for them, feeling the smooth, resistant texture of the wood. They weren't large enough to cover the entire gap, but they could be used to reinforce the blankets, to create a more solid barrier against the wind and snow. It was a fragile hope, but it was all he had. With renewed determination, Ilara began to work. He used pieces of rope, taken from old scrolls, to tie the wooden boards to the blankets, creating a kind of improvised patch. Lyra, seeing his determination, offered to help, holding the boards while he fastened them. Kyle, awakened by the movement, watched with curious eyes. With each board he managed to fix, the cold lessened a little, and hope, however small, rekindled. It wasn't perfect, far from it. The wind still whistled through some cracks, and the snow continued to accumulate outside. But it was better than nothing. It was an act of resistance, a defiance against the storm and the monsters it brought. When he finished, the sun began to peek through the heavy clouds, casting a pale light over the sanctuary. The bookshelf, now patched with blankets and wooden boards, looked like a healed wound, but still visible. The silence outside remained, heavy and unsettling. Ilara looked at his children, at Aurora, who was now beginning to wake, and felt a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. They had survived the night, but the battle for lasting security had not ended. It had merely changed form, from a physical confrontation to a silent war against fear and uncertainty. And Ilara knew, with a chill that did not come from the outside cold, that the days that followed would be the most challenging of their lives. Vorlag's shadow, even if invisible, still loomed over them. The first lights of a new day, pale and uncertain, crept through the patched gaps, painting the stone floor with grey stripes. The air, though less biting than the night before, still carried the storm's icy breath, a constant reminder of the fragile barrier separating them from the outside world. The blankets and binding boards, a mosaic of desperation and ingenuity, did their job, but the defense was precarious, a bandage over a deep wound that still bled cold. Ilara watched the children. Lyra and Kale slept nestled together, their small bodies seeking each other's warmth, oblivious to his exhaustive vigil. Aurora, in her improvised cradle, awoke with a small whimper, her blue eyes opening to the new day with a baby's untouched innocence. Her sight was a balm to Ilara's exhausted soul, but also a vivid reminder of the vulnerability that surrounded them. The primary reason for every desperate decision he had made. The silence outside was terrifying. There was no longer the furious howl of the wind that tore through the night, nor Vorlag's frantic hammering, just a heavy, suffocating quiet that followed the battle when the dust settles and the true extent of the devastation is revealed. Ilara wondered about the guard, the image of the man. Crushed under the weight of the bookshelf and snow was a dark stain in his mind. He was a monster, a relentless hunter, but still a human being. Lyra, a pregnant widow and a mother, had never wished death upon anyone, but Ilara, in his desperation to protect them, had been forced to act. The decision to push the bookshelf had been an act of instinctive protection, but the weight of that act, the shadow of that choice, now hung over him, colder than any wind, heavier than any guilt. He prepared more tea, the warm steam rising in aromatic spirals, a small ritual of hope amidst uncertainty. The miraculous herbs, with their power to warm and soothe, were more than just a drink. They were a symbol of the sanctuary's resilience, a reminder that even in the depths of despair, there was refuge, a source of healing. But the supply was not infinite, and food, water. The library offered knowledge and refuge, but no sustenance for a fleeing family. With each sip, Ilara felt warmth spread, but the concern for the future, for the storm's duration, for the possibility of other guards, was a cold that no tea could completely dissipate. Suddenly, a sound. Not the wind's howl, nor the groan of wood, nor the dragging of snow. It was a distant, muffled but unmistakable sound. A crack, and then another, like the creaking of something heavy moving in the snow or the snap of branches under considerable weight. Ilara froze, the hot cup trembling in his hands, his heart pounding in his chest. It couldn't be Vorlag, not after everything. But what if it was? What if he had survived wounded, yet with his thirst for vengeance intact? Or worse, what if it wasn't him? What if other guards, drawn by the sudden silence of the pursuit, had arrived? The library, once a safe refuge, now seemed a trap, its stone walls and books a fragile barrier against the cruelty of the outside world. He approached the gap, peering through a small opening between the blankets. The snow had stopped falling, but the world outside was a white, desolate landscape covered by a thick layer of ice. The sunlight, still faint, reflected off the whiteness, blinding him for an instant. He couldn't see anything, just the silent, icy vastness, but the cracks continued intermittent, each sending a shiver down Ilara's spine. It was as if the mountain itself was groaning under the weight of the ice, or as if something was moving, slowly, inexorably, towards them. The improvised solution was not enough. He needed something more, something that could permanently seal the sanctuary, or at least give them time to think, to plan. His eyes swept the room, desperate. There were no more binding boards, no more blankets that could be sacrificed. What else could the library offer? Books, yes, but how could books seal a gap? He moved among the shelves, his mind racing, searching for anything, any idea. His fingers brushed against leather spines, against ancient scrolls, and then on a lower shelf, almost hidden by a dusty rug, he noticed something different. It wasn't a book. It was a dark wooden box, carved with strange symbols that seemed to have been forgotten there for centuries. Curiosity, despite the fear, propelled him. He pulled it out, feeling the unexpected weight of the box. Opening it, he revealed a surprising content. Not books, but rolls of thick, resistant fabric, dark in color and almost waxy in texture. They were like tarpaulins, but more malleable, and seemed to have been treated with some substance to make them waterproof and insulating. They were ancient, yes, but incredibly well preserved, and there were several of them. A spark of hope ignited in Ilara's eyes. That could be the answer. Those rolls of canvas, if they were as resistant as they seemed, could be used to create a much more effective barrier than the blankets and boards. He could use them to cover the gap completely, perhaps even to create a second layer of insulation, restoring the sanctuary's warmth and peace. It was arduous work, but it was a chance. The cracks outside seemed to intensify, closer now, more defined. They weren't the groans of the mountain. It was something moving, something heavy. Ilara had no time to lose. With renewed determination, he began to unroll the first canvas roll. The texture was cold to the touch, but it promised resistance. He needed to act fast before whatever was out there reached the door. The battle for security had not ended, and the silence, which was once a threat, was now filled with the sound of his own hurried breathing and the rustle of the canvas being unrolled. The sanctuary, which had been a refuge, was now a battlefield, and Ilara, the father, was ready to fight again, not with brute force, but with the intelligence and courage of a parent who would do anything for his children. The fate of Aurora, of Lyra and Kale, depended on his hands, and he would not fail. Vorlag's shadow, and whoever else was out there, still loomed, but Ilara had found a new weapon, a new hope. In the depths of that forgotten library, the rustle of the canvas unrolling echoed in the sanctuary's heavy silence, a harsh sound that seemed to tear the morning's quiet. Ilara felt the cold, waxy texture of the fabric under his fingers, a promise of insulation, a new hope. The rolls were heavy, the material dense, and each movement required considerable effort from his already exhausted arms. But urgency was a relentless engine. The cracks outside, once distant and ambiguous, now became sharper, closer, like the sound of something breaking ice or dragging itself through deep snow. He started at the top of the gap, carefully extending the canvas, trying to cover the largest possible area. The fabric was stiff but malleable enough to be shaped, and Ilara used the same pieces of rope from ancient scrolls, now reinforced with leather strips he found in another forgotten box, to tie it firmly to the bookshelf and stone walls. It was slow, meticulous work, each knot an act of faith. Each inch covered a small victory against the cold and fear. Lyra, awakened by the noise and her father's silent urgency, sat up, her large, sleepy eyes watching. She didn't ask, didn't whimper. She just got up and, with the seriousness of a child who understands the gravity of the situation, began to help. Her small, clumsy fingers held the canvas in place while Ilara struggled to tie it, a silent and invaluable support. Kale, still half asleep, just watched, fascinated by the new wall his father and sister were building. Aurora, in the improvised cradle, slept deeply, oblivious to the battle raging around her. With each layer of canvas Ilara managed to fix, the air in the sanctuary seemed to grow a little warmer, the sound of the wind and cracks outside a little more muffled. The dark fabric absorbed the little light that entered, transforming the room into a more intimate, safer cocoon. But the feeling of security was fragile, a thin veil over the imminent threat. The cracks became more regular, heavier. It wasn't the sound of breaking branches. It was more like the dragging of something large and heavy, something that moved with difficulty, but with relentless determination. And there was a new sound, a scraping, as if claws or something sharp were scratching the frozen surface. Ilara's heart beat like a drum in his chest. It couldn't be Vorlag, not after everything. But what if it was? What if he had dragged himself out of the snow, wounded, yet still seeking vengeance? Or worse, what if it was something not human? The library, with its secrets and ancient aura, suddenly seemed more mysterious, more dangerous. He finished covering the gap with the first layer of canvas, feeling sweat trickle down his forehead despite the cold. The result was imperfect, but infinitely better than the blankets and boards. Now, the gap was completely sealed, a dark and impenetrable barrier, but he didn't stop. There were more rolls in the box, and Ilara knew he needed more than a single layer. He needed a fortress. As he worked on the second layer, his thoughts flew to the future. The miraculous teas, though powerful, were not food. The water collected from melted snow was finite. How long could they last there, isolated from the world, but also from its resources? With each sip of tea he took, with each crumb of dry bread he shared with Lyra and Kale, the concern grew. This refuge was a blessing, but also a prison, and time was an enemy as relentless as the guards. Suddenly, a dull thud. Not a crack, not a scratch, an impact. As if something heavy had collided against the bookshelf outside, against the improvised barrier he had just built. Ilara froze, the canvas slipping from his hands, his blood chilling in his veins. Lyra let out a small, muffled cry, her eyes wide with terror. Kyle began to whimper, another thud, stronger this time. The already weakened bookshelf shuddered. A sound of heavy scratching followed, as if something was trying to climb or perhaps trying to cling to the wood. It wasn't the sound of a man. It was something more primitive, more savage. The shiver that ran through Ilara was not from cold, but from a primal terror. He approached the barrier, pressing his ear against the canvas, trying to discern what was outside. The silence that followed the second thud was even more terrifying than the sounds. It was an expectant, heavy silence, as if the creature out there was assessing its prey, preparing its next move. Then a groan. Not a human groan. It was a hoarse, guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth, mixed with the muffled howl of the wind that still blew, though weaker. It wasn't Vorlag, it wasn't any of the guards. It was something different, something the storm had brought, or perhaps something the storm had revealed. Ilara recoiled, pulling Lyra close, covering Kale with his own body. The canvas, which had once seemed a fortress, now felt like a thin skin, about to be torn. The library, a sanctuary of peace and knowledge, had transformed into a fragile hiding place, and the world outside, once inhabited by cruel men, now seemed to harbor something far older and more terrifying. He looked at Aurora, who was now beginning to wake, her small blue eyes blinking. The promise of having his baby in peace seemed a distant memory, a dream shattered by brutal reality. But Ilara would not surrender. He was a father, and he would do anything to protect his children. With a new wave of determination, he picked up the next roll of canvas. The battle had not ended. It had merely changed enemies, and the darkness outside seemed deeper and older than any guard who had ever pursued him. Whatever was out there, it was hungry, and it was approaching. Whatever was out there, it was hungry, and it was approaching. Ilara grabbed the next roll of canvas, his muscles screaming in protest, but his mind focused on a single objective: protecting his children. The thuds became more violent, more frantic. The wooden bookshelf, serving as a barrier, groaned and creaked under the impact, like a ship in a relentless storm. Small fragments of wood splintered, and the sound of heavy claws scratching the canvas surface was hair-raising. Lyra, wide-eyed, clung to Ilara's skirt, a muffled sob escaping her lips. Kyle was openly crying now, the sharp sound of his despair piercing the already tense air. Aurora, in the improvised cradle, fully awoke, her tiny arms flailing, a faint cry beginning to manifest. The sanctuary, once a refuge of peace, had transformed into an echo chamber for terror. Lyra felt a sharp pang in her belly. It wasn't fear, it wasn't tiredness. It was the first contraction, a cruel reminder that time was running out in every possible way. The baby was coming, and the promised peace seemed more distant than ever. But the pain, instead of paralyzing her, ignited a new fury, a primal determination that only a mother can know. She would not allow anything or anyone to touch her children. With a strength he didn't know he possessed, Ilara began to unroll the second layer of canvas, covering the first with desperate urgency. The sounds outside were now unmistakable. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the mountain, it was the heavy dragging of a body, the scraping of monstrous claws, and a guttural snarl that seemed to come from an abyss of ice and fury. And then a gap opened in the upper canvas, an irregular tear revealing a glimpse of the horror. A red, bloodshot eye, surrounded by pale, ice-covered skin, and what appeared to be long, sharp claws, like stalactites of flesh and bone. It wasn't an animal. It was a man, or what was left of him, transformed into a grotesque creature by the storm's fury and perhaps by the library's own curse. Vorlag. The name echoed in Ilara's mind, a chill of recognition and terror. He had survived, but not as a man. The bookshelf shuddered again, and the canvas tore further, revealing a piece of the creature. Its arms were long and gnarled, covered in a layer of ice and fur. Its mouth was open in a silent snarl, its teeth sharp and brittle. It was trying to force its way through with a supernatural persistence. Ilara threw himself against the gap, pushing the canvas with all his strength, using his own body as a shield. "Lyra, get the books, the heaviest ones!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with effort. The girl, despite her terror, obeyed, dragging ancient, dusty volumes, piling them against the torn canvas. It was a fragile defense, but it was all they had. Another contraction hit Lyra, stronger, more painful. Ilara clenched his teeth, sweat trickling down his forehead. He could feel the warmth of the miraculous tea he had drunk, a strange and comforting energy flowing through his veins, giving him a clarity and strength that defied his exhaustion. It was as if the library itself, through its teas and its secrets, was fighting by their side. Vorlag's snarl intensified, and he tried to thrust a claw through the gap, scraping dangerously close to Ilara's face. He recoiled an inch, but did not yield. His eyes fixed on Vorlag's, a silent battle of wills. Suddenly a sound, not from outside, but from within. A soft, bluish glow began to emanate from the sanctuary's stone walls, pulsating rhythmically. It was faint at first, but quickly intensified, bathing the room in an ethereal light. The creature outside seemed to hesitate, its snarl transforming into a groan of pain or confusion. The light seemed to bother it, as if burning its icy skin. Ilara felt a wave of warmth and peace invade his body, calming Lyra's pain from the contractions, infusing him with an unexpected serenity. It was the library's magic, the power of the miraculous teas, manifesting to protect its sanctuary. Vorlag, now visibly tormented by the light, let out a roar of agony. He tried to pull away, but seemed trapped as if the gap itself was holding him. The bluish glow intensified even further, and the air around the gap began to freeze in intricate and beautiful patterns, encapsulating the creature's claw and arm. Vorlag's snarl diminished, replaced by a sound of cracks and snaps, like breaking ice. The blue light pulsed, and the creature, frozen in the act of its invasion, began to solidify. Its body, already covered in ice, transformed into a grotesque statue, a sculpture of terror and despair, forever trapped on the sanctuary's threshold. The red eye faded, and the snarl ceased. A profound silence fell upon the room, broken only by the soft cries of Kyle and Lyra, who now clung to Ilara, trembling. The blue light diminished, but did not disappear completely, remaining as a comforting glow on the walls. Lyra felt the final contraction, a powerful and irresistible pull. The danger had passed. The threat had been neutralized. The library had fulfilled its promise. With a sigh of relief and exhaustion, Lyra lay down on the soft, blanketed floor, Ilara and Kale beside her, watching with wide eyes. Amidst the newly won quiet, with the gentle warmth of the room and the bluish glow of the walls, Lyra gave birth to her baby. There were no screams, no panic, just Lyra's gasping breath, the soft cry of the newborn, and the comforting sound of Ilara and Kale, who now watched with admiration the tiny life that had just arrived. It was a girl, small and perfect, with Aurora's same blue eyes. Lyra held her against her chest, feeling the warmth of her skin, the miracle of her existence. She would call her Hope. The sanctuary was in peace. The storm outside had diminished to a distant whisper, and the cold could no longer penetrate the barriers of canvas and ancient magic. The cruel guards, including what remained of Vorlag, had found their end in the icy fury of the mountain or in the relentless protection of the library. Ilara looked at his family, Lyra, Kyle, Aurora, and now Hope, nestled in their embrace. The promise of having her baby in peace had been fulfilled, in a place where time seemed to stop and ancient magic watched over them. The library, with its secrets and its miraculous teas, had become not only a refuge, but a new home, a place where life against all odds could flourish. Winter still reigned outside, but within the heart of the library, a new spring had arrived.